So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Elsbeth Neal, Beth Neal, from the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, where she's a senior lecturer in the School of Social Work. Dr. Neal has conducted several important investigations focusing on contact of adoptive and birth families. And in the Contact After Adoption study, which she'll be talking about this morning, but also later on in this conference, she's now following children who were initially seen in childhood into adolescence and early adulthood. Beth hosted the Second International Conference on Adoption Research at UEA in 2006, and she works tirelessly to communicate her results, her research results, to practitioners and policymakers throughout the United Kingdom. She spoke at our very first RUD conference here in 2009 and is serving as a member of our advisory board. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Elsbeth Neal.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank Hal and the RUDs for organising this wonderful event and for inviting me to speak. It's a great honour and privilege. It's wonderful to follow Hal in this topic because he's really set the foundation, and everything that Hal has discussed about contact in infant adoptions we need to bear in mind when thinking about adoptions of children from care. But I want to explore, as Hal has mentioned, some of the additional layers of complexity of adoption for children from care. I think I'll just explain, because my research has all been carried out in the UK, a tiny bit of the context of this issue in the UK. So most children adopted in the UK have come through the care system. They're generally the under fives, very young children, and most of the children are placed not with foster carers or with kinship carers, but with new families. Most children will have a plan to stay in contact with somebody in their birth family, siblings, parents, grandparents, but it's more usual for children for that plan to be indirect contact, letters exchanged through an agency, but maybe about 20% or a quarter of children might have contact, direct contact with a birth relative after adoption. And all the other forms of contact that Hal mentioned as well can take place, and yes, we're experiencing lots of issues with social media is a very big topic in the UK as well. So the issues I want to highlight today are three overlapping and linked issues. I want to talk about pain, power issues, and the potential of contact when children are adopted from care. So I'm drawing on three studies that I've been working on over the last 17 years in the UK. Two studies have had contact, post-adoption contact, as their focus. The first, the Contact After Adoption study, is the longitudinal research that Hal mentioned earlier, and I'll be talking about this with my colleagues on Friday afternoon. We also carried out a study looking in more depth about face-to-face contact arrangements, and particularly how agencies can support and promote positive outcomes where children are having direct contact with birth relatives. And we've also carried out the study, the Helping Birth Family study, which has looked exclusively at care adoption from the point of view of birth relatives, and we talked to birth relatives at the time they were going through this compulsory process. So I'm drawing on our findings from all three of these studies in my talk this morning. So I want to begin with this issue of pain. So obviously for adopted children, what we're looking for is a happy ending, a good outcome for the child to have a new family where they feel loved and they belong and they have opportunities. But every adoption starts with something painful. For children adopted from the care system, children have either been abused and neglected or have been considered to be at risk of abuse and neglect in their birth families. So it's not social, cultural, financial reasons, it's issues of parental incapacity that are in the background for these children. Parents have often mental health difficulties, learning difficulties, substance misuse problems, violent relationships, as well as often socio-economic deprivation. So we know that it's common for adopted people to ask the question, why was I adopted? Who are my birth family? What does this mean for me in terms of who I am? And when we think what the answers to these questions are for children adopted from care, it's very difficult, painful facts and information that children have to incorporate into their sense, their own story of adoption. So this is true for all children adopted from care. How does it feel, to know that when you were young you were hospitalized because, you had a broken arm, or that your parents both had schizophrenia, or that you were left alone a lot as a baby, or that you were sexually abused? Some children as well will also have lived in these situations. Some children will be removed at birth because of these risks, often where older siblings have already been removed. Other children will have lived through these experiences, and we know that experiences of abuse and neglect can have a profound effect on children's development, on their resilience, on their ability to make new relationships, on their developmental progress. So these children have got a lot of pain in their background, either that they've lived through or that they have to think about, and for some children both. So when we think about how contact is going to work for these children, we have to take account of these issues of pain. We also have to consider the issue of risk management, where we're thinking about contact between the child and a parent who may have been involved in abuse or neglect. What we don't want to do is experience the child to more of these difficult and painful experiences. So risk management has to be on the agenda when thinking about adoption for children from care. And of course the issue of loss, which again is universal for all adopted children. But for children adopted from care, many will have experienced frequent changes in their caregiving environment. Maybe they've gone in and out of care as the social services have tried to support their family to look after them. Maybe they've moved within the foster care system and they've had multiple placements. So the issue of loss is very complex again for these children. It's both overt and covert. And we really have to tune into this from the child's point of view and think about who are the important people in this child's life. We have to think quite broadly about that, because I think sometimes, certainly in the UK, the legal framework and guidance leads us to think about the birth parents and birth parent contact, and that's important. But for some young people, it might be their siblings who are the people they really want to stay in touch with, or their grandparents, or their foster families. So we have to look very individually at children's relationships, their wishes and feelings, and these issues of loss and separation. We have to, for adoptive parents, as Hal has mentioned, adoptive parents have to engage with the idea of their child having another family. But for adoptive parents, how does it feel to think about the characteristics of your child's birth family? Adoptive parents are challenged, I think, to make sense of the complex needs and situations of birth relatives and to make sense of what's happened to their child. I think we shouldn't underestimate that challenge. What does it feel like, not just to think, well, your child's got another mum, but this other person didn't look after the person that you now love so much. I think this challenge is particularly real for adoptive parents when on a day-to-day basis they see the ongoing pain in their child, and where they see the pain coming into their relationship with the child. You know, if they see their own child finding it very hard to trust them and get close to them, isn't it natural that some adoptive parents feel great anger at the birth family for what's happened to their child, or that it's hard for adoptive parents to develop an empathic view of the birth family? So it's a particular challenge. It's also, there's lots of issues of pain for the birth family. So first of all, the loss for birth parents. It's not a loss that the birth parents have any control or choice over. These adoptions are achieved through compulsory legal procedures. An adoption order is possibly one of the most draconian orders in any country's legislation, because it involves the complete and irrevocable removal of the parents' rights. So in our Helping Birth Families study, we saw that although, you know, from the point of view of social services, they are pursuing the best interests of the child, from the point of view of the birth family, this is experienced as a highly hostile, disempowering process. It can't feel anything other than disempowering for the birth parent, because it is designed to disempower the birth parents, to overrule their consent and remove their rights. So it's not just that the child is lost, but it's the way in which the child is lost that is difficult for birth parents. Because it can give rise to great feelings of anger, resentment, powerlessness, resignation, passivity. And if these issues of pain for birth relatives are not addressed, if we don't think about them, if we don't help birth parents deal with them, they will get in the way in contact arrangements. The loss of the child is also often an ambiguous loss, because although the child is gone to the birth family permanently and irrevocably, they're still alive, they still exist somewhere, so the birth parent is left wondering, how are they okay, where are they, who are they with, what are they doing? And it's a disenfranchised loss. How can you tell other people, you know, when they ask you the question, do you have any kids? Yes, but they were taken away from me because I neglected them. There's huge social stigma attached to this type of loss. So it's very difficult for people to get support even within their own family. This type of loss can turn families against each other. It's difficult for them to get support socially. And even when birth relative support services are available, it's difficult sometimes for people to feel that anything can help them cope with this, or that they're worthy of having any help from anyone. Birth parents often also have the same issues of pain in their background that their own children have lived through. So a high number of birth parents whose children are adopted from care have themselves been abused and neglected and have loss and separation in their background. And as adults, this affects them in all sorts of ways, leading to the complex needs I mentioned earlier, people having mental health problems, difficult relationships, substance misuse problems. So I think for all parties here, we have to think about how are people managing these issues of pain, and what role is contact playing in helping people manage these issues of pain. So if we think about the child, if the child's relationship with the person they're having contact with, when they see or hear this person, they're going to have memories, they're going to have feelings about it. Contact is never going to be emotionally neutral for the child who's lived at home and lived through these experiences. So we have to think about whether what comes to the surface for the child is within what they can cope with. It might be helpful for things to come to the surface for the child so that their adoptive parents can help them deal with it and think these things through. But if these issues of pain overwhelm the child, we might need to think again, is contact or this type of contact with this type of person right now what this child needs, or do we need to meet their needs in other ways? If the issues for the adoptive parents and the birth relatives are not managed, that can also affect contact. I think obviously when we're thinking about contact, what's right for the child, what's best for the child must be the number one thing. But we mustn't dismiss the needs, feelings and situations of the adults, because if it doesn't work for the adults, it's not going to work for the child. And Hal has talked about the relationships dynamics between the adults. So if you're going along to a contact meeting to see somebody in your birth family and your adoptive parents are going with you, and you can feel, you know, how anxious they feel or how angry they seem to be with your mum and dad, and you get there and your birth family members seem to give off either directly or indirectly vibes that suggest they don't like the fact that you're in another family now, they don't like your new mum and dad. That's so difficult for the child. It's so difficult for the child to extract any benefit from that meeting. So we must tune into and think about and address these issues of pain for all three parties. Thinking now about the power issues in these adoptions, as I've mentioned earlier, the adoption involves the complete transfer of power and responsibilities from the birth family and from the state to the adoptive family. So the power issues are different before and after adoption. So let's think about the child first. As I mentioned, in the UK, most children adopted in the UK are very little. It's very hard for them to have a voice. They're dependent on the adults to think about and imagine what the child will want and need. I think what happens often is that the child's immediate needs are easier for professionals to think about, but we have to imagine the child into the future and anticipate their future needs in order to hear what the child's voice might be. Even when children are old enough to have an opinion, there's a number of challenges in hearing the child's voice. Do we really listen? Can we make sense of what the child is saying? Because it's very complex. How children are likely to feel about their birth family members are very complex, especially given the power dynamics that will have played out in the child's relationship with their birth parents. So a child might simultaneously love their mum, but feel they have to look after their mum and be frightened of their mum all at once. So we have to really dig down and listen to what a child's saying, not just verbally. We have to look at their behaviour during contact meetings. We have to look at their behaviour after contact meetings. We have to allow for the fact that the child's feelings might change over time so that we can really hear the child's voice when we're making our contact plans. For the adoptive parents, pre-adoption, adoptive parents can be both quite powerful and completely powerless, and we have to recognise both of these issues. So prospective adoptive parents can feel quite powerless in that often when they are told about a child needing adoption, the contact plan will have already been pretty much decided upon by the child social worker. And the adoptive parent might feel, well, I don't like the sound of that, or I don't think that's the right thing, but if I don't agree with it, maybe I'm never going to get a child placed with me. Adoptive parents may already have felt disempowered by the fact that they need the approval of this agency in order to become a parent. So adoptive parents can feel very powerless and forced into agreeing to arrangements they don't really feel. And I think Hal has described in his talk how entering into these arrangements with a willingness and an openness is a very important factor. On the other hand, adoptive parents, sometimes their voice gets heard very loudly at this stage because they're a scarce resource, especially an adoptive parent who's willing and wants to give a home to a child who might have special needs. They're a very scarce resource, and we need to treasure adoptive parents who can give a family to these children. So often, I think it is normal and natural that adoptive parents feel quite anxious about birth family contact, and they express these anxieties, and sometimes instead of maybe trying to work with adoptive parents about these anxieties, what happens is people think, well, what we need to do is kind of restrict the child's contact arrangements in order to get them placed. So often the child's needs for contact with their birth family is something that we compromise on because we think, well, maybe we can't place them. And so we need to be thinking about how we can help and support adoptive parents with their anxieties, rather than saying, well, you're anxious about contact, so we will kind of restrict the contact plans we're making for children. The birth family as well can be both extremely powerless and have a bit of power before adoption at the contact planning stage. As I mentioned earlier, birth parents experience the adoption process as hostile and disempowering. What we saw in our Helping Birth Families study is often at the point where a birth parent realises they're going to lose their child, probably, to adoption, it's such a shock, it's such a blow. People behave in ways that are not in their own best interest, let alone the child's. So people might become very angry with the social worker, they might refuse to come to meetings, they might become very depressed, they might overdose, they might go missing. So they become alienated and excluded, and their relationship with the agency deteriorates way before the child is placed for adoption, such that when we come to the point of the adoption order and thinking about contact plans, they're not involved, they're already excluded, they have no voice, and the agency has a very negative view and opinion of the birth relative and what they have to offer. On the other hand, we get the situation where the agency wishes to achieve this adoption and they feel they can do it easier if the birth parents don't contest or if they sign their consent. So sometimes where parents say, often at the very last minute, in the corridors outside the court, well, I'll sign the papers if you let me have such and such contact. So again, we might get arrangements that are made not driven by what the child needs, but by adult voices. After adoption, these power issues can change somewhat. As I mentioned earlier, children's views and feelings may change as they get into their adoptive family. Some children may feel after they've been in their adoptive family for a while, their need for contact with their birth family may lessen. For other children, it may increase as they get older. They may feel more confident to say, I do want to stay in touch with my birth family. We've got to keep listening to the child. We also have to think about how the power over the contact arrangements is going to transfer from the adoptive parents to the child as the child grows and develops. And that's challenging. For example, in our current study, we're finding, in one or two examples, suddenly the child is 18 and it's like, boom, everything is given over to them. Here, by the way, we've had contact with your mum for so many years, and here's a box of letters, and now you decide what to do. And it can be almost overwhelming to suddenly acquire this power in one go. For adoptive parents, yes, they have all the rights, all the responsibilities, all the control. These arrangements are virtually never legally enforceable in the UK. So if the adoptive parents wants to stop it, they can stop it. This power can make adoptive parents feel more open, feel more willing to have contact, because they feel more in control. So that can be a good thing. On the other hand, some adoptive parents will want ongoing support to manage these responsibilities, to manage these risks. They may feel at this contact meeting, I need to look after my child. I can't look after the birth mum and how she's feeling. So ongoing support is an issue. And for the birth family, they have no power over after adoption. They know if the adoptive parents want to stop it, they can stop it. This can be helpful. It can help people cooperate and respect boundaries. But also, it can be difficult to live with a very restrictive contact arrangement, sometimes too restrictive, to be perceived as a risk, to have so many boundaries in place. For example, you know, a grandparent maybe who has never abused or neglected her child will be given a very, you know, she has to have supervised contact with her grandchild, where she's even followed, you know, she moves to another side of the room. These, if we get that management of risk wrong, it's very disempowering for birth relatives and can stop them actually making suggestions and ideas about contact that are helpful. I think if we manage these issues of pain well, then there's a great potential for pain and power. We manage these issues well. Contact can have very positive benefits for children, despite everything I've said up to now. It can help young people with their questions, to understand why they're adopted, to stay in touch with people they want to stay in touch with. Why should I have to lose these important people in order to gain a new family? And it can help both parents and children to be open within the adoptive family. It can help adoptive parents get the information to answer their kids' questions. It can help them deal with their fears and anxieties. It can help them feel closer to their child. It can mitigate loss, issues of loss for the birth family, and reassure birth parents about their anxieties. Is my child okay? And it can be a way for a birth parent to show, although they couldn't care for their child, they still care about them. And being able to contribute is something that really helps birth family members. We see what works, Hal said at the beginning. What works is what Hal describes, where the adults can get along and negotiate, where adoptive parents and birth relatives can understand and support each other's perspective. I think the difficulties of achieving good outcomes in contact are increased the more the difficulties in the placement in general increase. And this is one of the paradoxes, that the older the child is, the more they might want and need contact, but the more emotionally complex it might be for them. Therefore, you know, the more support and management we have to get in. Finally, I know a lot of you here have got a background in practice and are still working in practice, and that's my own background as well. So what does this mean in practice? I think it means when we think about contact, we have to start at the top of this cycle, having a clear vision about what we're trying to achieve. What potential do we think contactors have? We need to think about the benefits for the child, but also how it will impact on the adopters and the birth relatives. And everybody needs to know what we're trying to achieve. We have to assess, we have to think about the issues of pain and how well people are able to manage them. Then we make our contact plan. I think often we start with making the contact plan. We need to think about how we support the contact to make sure we manage the issues of power and pain, and we need to keep the arrangements under review. That may mean we need to increase the contact, it may mean we need to stop the contact. So that's some of my ideas about how we make it work in practice. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. Here's some information about 2 websites where you can find out a lot more about the detail of our research studies. Okay.